Beginning in the late 1970s, Detroit-born Barry Bremen lived the life most could only dream of. It just wasn't his own. The charade started on February 4th, 1979, when Barry was able to make his way onto the floor of an NBA All-Star game by wearing a uniform of the Kansas City Kings. While he was able to make it onto the floor, during the pre-game warm UPS, an actual player for the Kings, Otis Birdsong, approached him and said, "You're on my team and I don't even know who you is," thus outing him and ending his first attempt at being an imposter. But this encounter would provide fuel for Barry's lusts for deception. In July of the same year, Barry moved into the baseball season with gusto and was able to get into Kingdom Field at the 1979 LB All-Stars game, which was Seattle's most watched game in the history of baseball. Justice New York Yankee Barry was able to stay on the field for a full 30 minutes, actually catching fly balls and attempting to pose for an all-star picture, standing amongst greats such as Reggie Jackson, Joe Morgan, and Gaylord Perry, before finally being identified as a fake and being escorted out by ushers. It seems his discovery was more likely to be delayed at all-star games as opposed to regular games, as there was more diversity of teams and players, and thus more of a likelihood of him not being found out at the 1980 Baseball World Series game. Barry would go on to expand his horizons by taking on the role of an actual official. He was able to casually walk out to home plate with actual umpires of the game, standing next to such well-known umpires as Paul Pryor and Harry Windelstedt, and most would agree that was the appeal, the acclaim, the attention. Standing by the greats, because it seemed Barry craved the spotlight. As an amateur athlete himself, perhaps he was living out a life he felt he had missed out on. And he certainly looked the part. If standing at 6'3", he often was accepted as an athlete based simply on the rarity of his height. 1 year later at the 1981 NBA All-Stars game, Barry again got onto the floor by donning the uniform of the Houston Rockets and was actually able to take warm-up shots with the team before being noticed in a continuation of his role as an authority figure through the wearing of the same uniform officials wore. Barry was able to stand next to some of the greats, masquerading as one of their own during the playing of the national anthem at Game 5 of the World Championships at the Boston Gardens. He later was able to successfully play rounds of golf on a professional field during a tournament and was able to impersonate a San Diego mascot. And once, he even wore a Dallas Cowboys cheerleading uniform onto the field of a football game. He outdid himself, though, in 1985 when he was able to make his way onto the Pasadena Civic Auditorium stage of the Emmy Awards, a huge television award program watched by much of America back in that time. When the award was called for Betty Thomas for Hill Street Blues, Barry came onto the stage and confused the presenter, Peter Graves, by walking onto the podium and accepting the Best Supporting Actress award for Thomas in her place, saying that she could not make it that night. He was fined $175 for the so-called prank and simultaneously amused and confused millions. 1986 would be his last foray into the world of imposter baseball. He put on the uniform of the New York Mets at the Astrodome and was able to get onto the field, where he shagged flies for a bit before being confronted by manager Tommy Lasorda, who was not persuaded when Barry said it was just his intent to get one chance at a hit during batting practice. Tommy Lasorda was not amused and used many profanities to describe his dislike of the situation. Barry was arrested and held in jail for 7 hours until being bailed out. That would be his last major foray into the world of professional pretend. Barry says that he was treated with such disregard and incivility that it left a bad taste in his mouth, and he never wanted to do the imposter gig again. On his 64th birthday, Barry passed from cancer. Mamoru Samuragochi, born in Japan in 1968, has been credited with popular soundtracks on video games such as on Resident Evil, DualShock, as well as on Onimusha Warlords. And he would have been remembered as a talented, but probably unremarkable composer, if it wasn't for one characteristic: his deafness. Finding his footing as a celebrity composer in the mid-90s, Samuragochi played the part of a tortured artist, someone who loved music but couldn't hear the music, could only feel it most of his life. He claimed to be a Beethoven of such, after having gone fully deaf at the age of 35, due to a degenerative condition caused by migraines. He astounded people with his beautifully poignant music, which touched millions and was used in popular works and unofficial national anthems. Despite his disability, he was able to compose music, using what he described as his, quote, absolute pitch, and he supposedly used the skill to compose such hits as Symphony No. 1 Hiroshima, a tribute to those lost in the 1945 bombing of what would later become his hometown. This symphony was first performed in 2008 and gained national acclaim. It was this symphony that catapulted Samuragochi's fame into the realm of becoming a household name in Japan. He once said on the topic of his disability that his deafness was in fact an attribute. Quote, I listened to myself. If you trust your inner sense of sound, you can create something that is truer. It is like communicating from the heart. Losing my hearing was a gift from God. Samuragochi had previously enjoyed being hailed as the Beethoven of the digital age and reveled in the attention. But then scandal hit. It was revealed that not only was he not a composer, he couldn't even write sheet music, but he wasn't even deaf, he was completely hearing. People had initially started to question the charade back in June of 2013, when a journalist for Area magazine who was interviewing Samuragochi noticed some of the oddities in regards to how he was able to answer questions before the interpreter finished signing them, and how he responded by standing up at the sound of a normal doorbell. The journalist cast out on his deafness, and the composer was questioned in the press with such headlines as "The Deaf Genius Composer." Is Mamoru Samuragochi genuine? Initially in February of 2014, Samuragochi produced a Level 2 disability certificate, claiming he had lost his hearing, but then regained his hearing. But later in March of that same year, Samuragochi recanted his story while at a press conference and said he would return the certificate as he did not meet the legal requirements for a disability. It was also revealed that the cane he used was a prop and wholly unnecessary. Some people who heard of this scandal would say that Samuragochi's rise to fame had to do more with the uniqueness of his disability situation and less with the work itself. But this is in fact untrue, as the work was powerful and beautiful, and truly did touch millions. It just wasn't his. Whose was it? Takahashi Inagaki, while he taught music, he was actually forced to keep his biggest achievement a dark secret for 18 years. He had been composing music for Samuragochi and letting him publish it as his own, supposedly created despite his deafness. The real composer, Inagaki, eventually came clean when a popular figure skater was slated to use one of his songs. In the 2014 Winter Olympics, he didn't want to include another person, unknowingly in the lie. Inagaki apologized publicly and hinted at an element of a power imbalance between the ghost composer and the imposter. He said, quote, I am an accomplice of Samuragochi because I continued composing just as he demanded, although I knew he was deceiving people. In fact, Inagaki was paid a mere 7 million yen, 77,000 American dollars, spanning over 17 years and more than 20 masterpieces. That is less than $4,600 a year for what was making Samuragochi millions. While at first, Samuragochi pretended to be deaf to his ghostwriter, who he hired originally as an assistant. That act soon wore off, and he revealed his true self: a hearing person. Nagaki said that the fake composer would threaten, in normal spoken language, to take his own life if the lie became public. And so for that reason, he felt compelled to stay and continue creating music. After these revelations, Samuragochi is now part of a lawsuit where he could be held liable for over 61 million yen, almost $600,000 in lost ticket sales and revenue, for his canceled musical tour. Gerald Barnbaum lived a fine, if not mundane life as a pharmacist, but in 1971, he was convicted of medical fraud through Medicaid and had his pharmacist license revoked. Instead of moving into a different field, he doubled down and decided just to become a doctor, but not in the conventional way. He legally changed his name to Gerald Barnes and took on the identity of Dr. Gerald Barnes from Stockton, California. Gerald would go on to practice in the Los Angeles area for 3 years until his lack of actual medical knowledge caused a tragedy to occur. 29-year-old John Mackenzie came in to see the supposed Dr. Barnes for chronic fatigue, extreme thirst, dry mouth, and rapid weight loss. Despite Mackenzie displaying classic signs of type 1 diabetes, Gerald sent him home with medication for vertigo. After taking some blood to test, a few days later when Mackenzie's blood test came back, Gerald's physician's assistant noticed right away the alarming results. His blood glucose levels were over 12 milligrams, a lethal level. The PA called the police right away. But when they arrived at Mackenzie's apartment, he was already dead, having fallen into an untreated diabetic coma. This gross negligence was what alerted Dr. Barnes' staff that the man they were working for was not who he seemed. A police investigation was opened up, and in 1980, Gerald was charged with second-degree murder, but eventually pleaded the charges down to manslaughter and practicing medicine without a license. He served just 19 months of his 3-year and 4 months sentence and was released in 1982, just to continue practicing medicine without a license until he was again caught, this time applying for hospital privileges. When he applied for hospital privileges, the actual Dr. Barnes found out and informed authorities. This time he was convicted of grand theft as well as larceny and sentenced to another 3 years in jail. After being released, he would go on to assume the identity of a San Francisco pharmacist, Donald Barnes, but was caught. After applying for a job at an pharmacy, this did not deter him, as in 1995, he played what was arguably the biggest role in his career when he impersonated a doctor at the Executive Health Group, a company in charge of doing the medical evaluations for FBI agents and executives of the Federal Reserve Bank. Gerald performed physicals on over 70 agents of the FBI, with some estimates citing him having examined hundreds of FBI agents. The truth eventually caught up to him, though, when an investigator from one of his old cases retired, and a new and eager detective inherited the case files and tracked Gerald down. Under the intense stress of questioning, Gerald broke down and faked having suicidal thoughts. And when that didn't deter the questions and scrutiny, he feigned having a heart attack. He was eventually sentenced to various counts, such as mail fraud, unlawful dispensing of a controlled substance, and fraudulent use of a controlled substance, as he had erroneously prescribed many medications to his patients, some wholly unnecessary or dangerous. These newest charges got him sentenced to 12 and 2 years in federal lockup, but in 2000, during an intra-prison transfer, Gerald escaped and somehow managed to land a job at a medical clinic and work there for 4 weeks before being apprehended by U.S. Marshals. He was only sentenced 6 additional months for the escape. The real people he impersonated spent years rebuilding their failed credit and reputations. Gerald Barnbaum died not as a doctor or as a pharmacist, but as a prisoner in 2018 at the age of 84.